Thank you for joining our panel discussion, Attrition in AI, Strategies for Retaining Diverse Talent, with Dr. Jeff Brown, Dr. Allison Scott, and Akua Kwanzaa. I'm Tina Park, and I'm the head of inclusive research and design at the Partnership on AI, and I'll be facilitating the conversation with everyone today. For those of you who are participating in a PAI event for the first time, PAI is a leading independent nonprofit partnership of academic, civil society, industry, and media stakeholders who have come together to explore and address important and difficult questions around the current and future social impact of AI and machine learning technology. At the core of our work is the belief that the convergence of diverse perspectives representing all the different stakeholders of ethical and responsible development of AI generates more thorough and innovative solutions. This is why the pursuit of equity and inclusion is so integral to the work that serves to our work, and it serves as guiding principles to all of our different projects. Over the last year and a half, we've been really fortunate to lead a project in partnership with DeepMind, examining the ongoing loss of workers from underrepresented and otherwise minoritized backgrounds from the AI tech sector. This can include people whose social identities, such as those related to race, ethnicity, gender, or ability, have been historically marginalized by those in more dominant social groups, specifically within AI and the broader tech sector, but also more generally in society. Dr. Jeff Brown's findings have just been released as a report available on PAI's website. I think Josh will drop that link sporadically throughout our conversation. So I hope you all get a chance to read it if you haven't already. And while this focus on diversity of AI teams might seem a bit tangential to issues around algorithmic harm, which tends to be the focus of PAI's work, we have seen the important role that individuals who are building these algorithmic models have on the kind of models that are built and the types of issues that are identified and mitigated. So who exactly is designing the technologies becomes a really key consideration when we're developing strategies to identify and minimize the harms that AI and algorithmically driven technology can have, especially those that perpetuate existing human bias and systemic injustice. Today, we're very, very lucky to have three phenomenal experts who have spent their careers examining and implementing strategies on how AI and the broader tech sector can recruit and retain a diverse body of employees who are empowered to use their experiences and histories to build better technology that can serve and benefit everyone. And before I turn it over to each of them to quickly introduce themselves, just a little bit of housekeeping. For all of you who are listening in, I really encourage you to be active in the chat. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself and connect with other folks who are also concerned around these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Introduce yourself with your name, your organization, the role that you have in that org, your pronouns, and maybe drop in one thing that you're really excited to hear about from this panel today. You should also use the chat to flag any questions that you might have for our panelists, as well as any reactions you might have to what they're saying. My fabulous colleague Josh is working in the background and keeping track of any questions. So we're going to actually feed them into our panel throughout the next hour. We're also really committed to creating an inclusive community at all of our events. So we really encourage you to engage one another as respectfully as possible. If anything does come up that causes discomfort or harm, please flag it for my colleague Josh so that we can find a way to remediate it. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over. Jeff, please tell us who you are.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Brown, and I'm a D&I research fellow here at PAI. I've been leading this study as Tina said, as Dr. Park said, over the past year and a half on the state of DEI on AI teams specifically, and especially as it concerns minoritized folks working on these teams and their attrition from these teams and these companies. I'm also an assistant professor in school psychology at San Diego State University. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much. Akua, how about you?
Sure. So hello, everyone. I want to start off by just noting that I'm in Toronto, Canada, which is located on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land. So I'm the head of equity, diversity, and inclusion at CFAR, which is a Canadian-based global research organization that convenes top researchers from around the world. And these amazing researchers work together to address the most important questions facing science and humanity. We have over 400 researchers from 160 plus institutions in a number of countries. And the focus of our organization is on long-term multidisciplinary collaborations. So my role is focused on implementing our EDI action plan, which covers all aspects of the work of our organization, from the research programs that are working on high risk and high reward questions, to our knowledge mobilization activities, to our next generation initiatives, to our Pan-Canadian AI strategy, which, about approximately 5 years ago, CFAR was appointed by the Canadian government to lead the Canadian national AI strategy. So of course my work is linked to that as well. So I'm grateful to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. So happy to have you. And last but not least, Allison.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining, and thanks for the invitation to be here. My name is Allison Scott, and I'm the CEO of the CFAR Foundation. We are based in Oakland, California, and we work at the intersection of racial justice and technology. Our overarching mission is to create a more equitable technology ecosystem that addresses longstanding racial inequality, that creates economic opportunity, and that reflects the power and the perspectives of communities of color. I'm a social scientist by training, so I'm particularly interested in examining the systems and structures that create inequality, and I'm thrilled by Dr. Brown's new study. And across the foundation, our priorities span the entire ecosystem. We're looking at computer science, access and equity in the K-12 space, pathways into tech jobs, both traditional and non-traditional, D&I practices and policies in the workforce, and then last but not least, increasing diversity of entrepreneurs and venture capitalists in the tech space.
Thanks so much. As I mentioned at the top of our webinar, we're really lucky to have 3 individuals whose work is really dedicated and centers on this issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the tech sector, and happen to also work in organizations that prioritize this. And so just to get us started, I would love to hear from each of you about your organization's current priorities as they relate to EDI issues in tech and AI. I think, Allison, because you gave such a lovely description of the work that you were doing already, if you could expand on that a bit, that would be great. We'll start with you.
Sure. So I would characterize, again, we're focused on the entire ecosystem. We break it down into the 4 priority areas. And we are, as a researcher myself, we're very interested in conducting research and understanding the state of diversity across the tech ecosystem. So we just published a report, I think just a few weeks ago, with the NAACP on the state of the Black tech ecosystem, which really just demonstrates that there's been a lack of progress, any meaningful progress towards increasing representation across all levels. And then also really critiquing and calling attention to some of the harms of technology, some of the harms of algorithmic bias and other aspects that have disproportionately impacted communities of color. And then there's a separate scope of work that I think is very related to this conversation around increasing access and equity in K-12 computer science education. So how are we preparing the next generation of young people and of scholars to both understand algorithms and their role in society, but also to be able to question the ethical implications and ethical, societal, political implications of algorithmic systems as well.
Thanks so much. And Josh has wonderfully dropped in that link to the publication, the Black Tech Ecosystem, which is really great. Please do check it out. Ikwa, how about you? What is CFAR's priorities in this area?
So CFAR, as I mentioned, has this comprehensive EDI action plan that touches on everything that we do as an organization. So addresses EDI in leadership and governance, in HR and talent, in operational and data accountability, and obviously in our research and knowledge mobilization activities, and then in our role in the broader research community. So we're in the early stages of the implementation of that plan. But our first initiative, because we are a research community, our first initiative has been to collect data from all of our researchers, our staff, our leadership, our board, to understand who's in our community in terms of race, sexual orientation, gender, and other aspects of identity. And then we also want to know how people experience our organization. So we're asking about whether members of the CFAR community feel like their opinions and expertise are valued. Do they feel like we've addressed barriers to full participation? Have they experienced harassment at CFAR? What can we do to better foster a sense of belonging? And we're hoping that the answer to this question will help to guide the implementation of our plan. We know as an organization, obviously, that EDI matters to research. Research can help so many people, but it can also harm so many people. Look at scientific concepts of race, for example, that have been used to perpetuate, white supremacy and justify exploitation and genocide. So CFAR wants to attract and retain a diverse pool of researchers because this strengthens our collaborations and results in research that's more relevant globally. So we can't harness the power and promise of that amazing diversity without creating an inclusive environment. So we don't have the findings to those surveys yet, but we will be taking a very close look at them to guide our implementation moving forward. And then on the Pan-Canadian AI strategy side of things, I'm working very closely with our executive director of the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, Alyssa Strom, on increasing Indigenous representation and inclusion within our AI training programs, and with organizations that we partner with to deliver AI training programs. So looking at, how we can increase access, but also how we can, look at, the content of the training and how we can make sure that it's relevant and incorporates Indigenous ways of knowing and being.
That's really fantastic to hear. And I know that CFAR's EDI action plan agenda is posted online and public. And I know I've looked at it several times to get inspiration and guidance for the work that I do as well. So again, if you have a chance, you should definitely check that out. Jeff, what is PAI doing?
I should throw the question back at you as PAI's head of inclusive research and design, but I'll just paraphrase from our mission statement and on our values. Equity inclusion is definitely one of our main values here at PAI. We're a multi-stakeholder organization, and again, paraphrasing from what we assert as our values, we empower diverse voices to participate from ideation through implementation, striving for fairness, equity, and inclusion. And I want to underline those last three words: fairness, equity, inclusion. So we can't strive for a more inclusive AI technologies. We can't strive for fair, more equitable AI technologies if the folks designing these technologies don't represent the folks who are being affected by these technologies, and more specifically, are negatively affected by these technologies. So quite early into PAI's founding, we've made equity inclusion one of our main priority areas, or one of our priority areas. This project that I just completed, this report that we just released, I would say is one of the main pieces of evidence of that. So yeah, we are hoping in our broader mission to convene a diverse set of stakeholders to push forward equity inclusion as one of our main areas, essentially. Anything you want to add, Dr. Park?
No, that is a perfect encapsulation. All three of you mentioned both the role of recruiting really individuals with diverse backgrounds and perspectives, but also the role of retention in that of those team members, whether it's within a research community or within the tech sector more broadly. I know for PAI, the focus was specifically on attrition because there's been a lot of work already done around pipeline issues. Kapor Center, again, has done a lot of work on this in terms of the role of K-12 education in building strong pipelines into STEM education and STEM degrees for Black and Brown students and other students of color. But I did want to hone in on here in terms of what are some of the key factors that are leading to the loss of these minoritized team members from AI and the broader tech sector? So what are we seeing in terms of the research community that CFAR gets to work so closely with? Are they staying? Are they leaving? Why? Jeff, if you could speak a little bit to the findings from your own report. And then again, Allison, with the work that you all have done, really diving deep into the full life cycle of sort of the bringing in talent into these organizations. Yeah, what are some of the key factors that are leading to some of this loss that we're seeing? I can call on folks, or if you want to jump right in, please feel free.
I can jump in.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about this actually more broadly than just CFAR, but also in the broader AI and tech ecosystem. Issues like isolation, discrimination, harassment, lack of equity and compensation, lack of transparency around promotion, the list goes on. In the Canadian context, there was a report released in 2018 by Mars, which is an innovation hub in Toronto. And the report focused on diversity, inclusion, and belonging in the tech sector in Toronto specifically. And it's clear from the report that minoritized folks experience the tech workplace much differently than those in dominant groups. For example, women gave scores significantly lower than men when they were asked if they have equal opportunity to thrive at their company, if tasks are divided fairly, if they're able to voice their opinions. 62% of women said they had been subjected to bias based on one or more aspect of their identity, compared to 34% of men. Black employees reported significantly lower levels of inclusion and belonging. They gave lower scores when they were asked if their company represents a diverse group of talent, if they have equal opportunities, if they're part of decision-making processes, if they feel they have fair salaries and benefits compared to employees at similar levels. And overall, if they feel like they belong. 66% of Black employees reported that they had been subjected to bias, compared to 47% of white employees. So if you don't feel like you're in a place where you have psychological safety, and I know, Jeff, your report, identifies toxic workplaces as a factor. If you feel like you're not being compensated fairly, if you feel like you're not able to contribute meaningfully, then chances are you're going to leave if you can. So I think that applies to a lot of different workplaces and a lot of different sectors.
Yeah, Jeff, I remember reading your report and seeing the same thing around toxic workplaces. What were workers sharing with you about their experiences? And does that map onto what Iko is also talking about?
Yeah, that maps on perfectly to what Iko was talking about. The statistics she mentioned, the experiences that she mentioned, the factors that she mentioned, essentially is what we heard from a lot of our participants that we interviewed. Essentially, a lot of these companies or organizations would state that equity, inclusion, diversity was a big part of their own values as companies or organizations. But these workers were very good at seeing through maybe some of the lip service that some of these organizations were paying to these values of diversity, equity, inclusion. And instead, seeing that when the rubber hit the road, these companies only had the values of the dominant group in mind. These companies only had the bottom line in mind. So when it came time to choose between bottom line or perhaps a better work environment for minoritized workers, bottom line would win usually. What we also saw from a lot of our participants was that things went on as they had done in the past. So even though a lot of these companies and organizations talked about wanting to innovate or innovation or wanting to listen to the workers or reinvent their practices to be innovative or new or what have you, we still saw some of the old practices driven by predominantly white cis heterosexual male, old guard, if you will. We saw a lot of those still predominating. And one concrete example of that was hiring and promotion, especially promotion practices. And so when these workers saw that their hiring, for example, or that promotion, for example, was that these companies really didn't listen to DEI best practices in terms of either, it would send a message to them that, well, does this organization really have the needs of minoritized workers as a priority? They would see that they did not, and this would either encourage them to fight for change or leave, or the workers that did fight for change, they would eventually get tired and then they would eventually leave. So it pretty much maps on.
Yeah. Allison, I know in your work, you've really taken a holistic view of the gain and loss process. And I'm wondering what you've seen in terms of compounding effects over the course of that long time scale that you tend to study.
Yeah, I think what's already been mentioned has been really comprehensive in terms of understanding what the specific push and pull factors are that are increasing turnover, especially among underrepresented groups. So I think when we think of the life cycle of employees across tech, we're thinking about What are the recruitment and hiring processes that get us to the teams that lack diversity in the first place? So, there's a ton of research that's been done there. But really important to say that I think we still need a lot of work to address where we're recruiting from, how we're assessing talent, how we are bringing talent into different organizations and teams. And then once the talent is there, as you asked, I think it cannot be overstated. And both of the panelists before me already mentioned that exclusionary and toxic cultures is a pervasive theme that we continue to hear in research study after research study, everything from microaggressions to overt discrimination and harassment. There was a study in 2021 by DICE, and almost half of Black technologists reported experiencing racial inequality in hiring, promotion, leadership opportunities, salaries, and benefits. So this goes back to the point around, lip service about, valuing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and perhaps even having a diversity lead or chief diversity officer. But the folks who are from underrepresented backgrounds and are still finding themselves subject to these types of cultures and behaviors. And we did a study in 2017 called the Tech Leaver Study, which demonstrated some of the factors that led to folks leaving, and found some of the very same things. So 5 years, 4 years, 5 years later, we're still seeing the same trends. And then two other things I would just mention are the wage gap is another thing that I think gets a little bit of, it does get some attention, especially around equal pay days. But I think that is also a driving factor in terms of turnover. And then leadership decision-making, we've seen a lot of these, like big high profile issues. So Google would be one of them with the firing of Timnit Gebru. But decision-making in leadership positions, which those leadership positions often lack diversity, related to things around ethical considerations, or dealing with complaints, or just how to ensure that Black, Indigenous, and other underrepresented populations are feeling included, are real significant drivers I've seen of turnover.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting from the Leaky Tech Pipeline report that your center released is that feeling of exclusion and the toxic workplace is sort of happening at every stage. So, you talked about college departments around like computer science that are also fairly hostile towards especially Black engineers and Black computer scientists who are trying to, get their degrees. And by the time they actually get to work on their dream project, it's happened to them several times over. I am curious around, all of you sort of came to tech with experience working on DEI issues from a lot of other sectors. And I'm wondering, is there anything particular about AI or tech that makes the manifestation of these issues any different? Or is it, the same story of like, we're seeing what happens in the medical field or within schools, just being replicated in the AI and tech sector? Or is there something particular that we should be attentive to about AI tech workers? Jeff, it looks like you want to jump in.
I can start. As a researcher who studied discrimination or systemic discrimination in various settings, communities, schools. We do see a lot of similarities actually between how this operates in the tech sector and in AI, even specifically. It's kind of like the meme goes, we live in a society, right? And so the tech sector and AI is not exempt from a lot of the kind of broader systemic discrimination or systemic the systemic prejudice and discrimination that we face in other aspects of society. What is a little bit different about tech and AI, I'll talk about tech briefly, and then I'll talk about AI. What is a little bit different is the composition of a couple things, the culture and the composition, right? So the demographic composition is predominantly white male, which again exists in other sectors as well, but it's also, tech sector is also very young. And so there is also this illusion of, meritocracy, one could say, within the tech sector that I think masks a lot of different issues, right? So you have folks working on technical systems, and in their own mind, it's, you know, they're being egalitarian or they're being meritocratic. It's whoever codes the best or whoever, you know, comes up with, you know, with the best project or software, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, not realizing that they too are subject to the same prejudices and biases that wider society faces. So if you don't recognize it, you can't really control for it. You can't do anything about it. So that is one aspect of it. In AI more specifically, I think more work needs to be done to be disentangled, or to disentangle what is specific about AI. I think the project and the report started circling around on some of these factors that are AI specific. One of them, and I heard from a lot of the participants in the study, is that they came to AI to work on social problems, right? Or to essentially work on social good, right? So they work, no matter what their role was, whether they were in policy or whether they were on more quote unquote technical, working on more quote unquote technical roles. They came to AI, or they wanted to work on AI to, you know, work on these AI technologies that affected minoritized communities like them, or like, you know, other communities that they cared about. But a lot of them, what happened when they actually came into the job, and what they saw is they saw some of the same, again, biases and discrimination that existed elsewhere, right? Or instead of focusing on a social problem, they were made to focus on the company's bottom line or the organization's bottom line. So it's sort of that dissonance between, oh, I came here to work on this awesome thing, but what I'm actually doing is maybe perpetuating some of these systems that were in place. And if I fight against it, then the company or the organization either subtly or overtly pushes me out, as kind of a couple of the, as Dr. Scott was mentioning, happened with Dr. Timney Guru. So again, more work needs to be done to disentangle some of these factors specific to AI, but I would say that's a start.
Great. Anything to add? Just really quickly, before we shift into thinking about, you know, what can be done about these issues that you've all identified, we have a question from the audience. Do you have a sense of whether the ability to work remotely has had any impact so far on attrition issues? And this can be more anecdotally from, you know, the folks that you've worked with and have been able to chat with versus a more formal report, because I don't know if we've had the time yet to really dive into that as a research question.
You know, in some ways, I'll just, you know, give my thoughts that are based on just my own experience. But you know, I find that when people are working remotely, they're not facing the same microaggressions, you know, the same, you know, direct harassment and discrimination that they face when they are actually in the workplace. So in some ways that may, you know, cause people to stay, you know, more often than not. But I mean, obviously we're seeing the great resignation in so many sectors. And I think that employers need to look at that a little bit more carefully, because I think people are just assuming, well, it's happening in all sectors, so, you know, it's okay. But there are definitely conditions of work that are leading to that as well, that we need to think about how we're going to change and shift as we think about the future of work. I know a lot of people, you know, talk about that, but, you know, the future of work and how we want our workplaces to look like in the future, so that we can, you know, retain the diverse talent that is so beneficial to AI and to the tech sector more broadly.
Yeah.
I would just add, totally echoing what Akua said. I can't remember what source it was, and if I find it, I'd happily drop it into the chat. Just about, I think it was Black tech workers in the remote space, like feeling like there was more, feeling like the culture was more inclusive. So not having to deal with those daily microaggressions. My only hesitation with that being a longer term trend towards like more diversity and inclusion across the sector would be we know so much happens in networks and relationship building. And so if you're working in isolation and while you don't have to deal with microaggressions, like what are your like what are your longer term trajectories within the company as it relates to, or the organization as it relates to mentorship and promotion and being assigned special projects, or like the ability to kind of progress in an organization versus, which I think these are, the ongoing challenges that we're facing related to advancement of diverse talent as well.
Yeah, pretty much what we heard from some participants. Again, this wasn't a primary goal of the study, although if I could go back in time, I would make it another primary goal of the study, right? So the study started in late 2020, and could I go back in time, I would make a whole another subdomain about remote work. But we did hear some participants talking about them pretty much being able to avoid the people that they wanted to avoid more easily being remote. We also saw, and I'll talk about something positive, we also saw this bring out or it created an opportunity for managers to be supportive. We heard this especially in female participants, some who had families, for example, right? So I heard from one participant, I think to paraphrase what this participant said, she said, when I think about my team, I think, or my manager, or my team and my manager, the word family focused comes to mind. And this particular supportive manager who was female made it a point to during the pandemic, when childcare was hard to find, all these other factors that we are all so aware of, this manager saw an opportunity to support her team in this very specific way, and actually made their team more inclusive. So that wasn't a primary goal of the study, but that is kind of a shadow recommendation that came out of it.
Thanks for sharing that, Jeff. And that's actually the perfect pivot point. We've identified some of the issues, but let's talk about what can change, what innovations we can start to implement. So what are the key characteristics that we should be striving towards in terms of the kind of inclusive organizations that are necessary to really support and sustain minoritized employees in the tech sector? So, Jeff, you were just talking about acknowledging that people have families and acknowledging that families play a role in your day-to-day life. Making that apparent and factoring that into how you manage the relationships with your employees is one thing. What are some of the other characteristics that you think we need to really be driving towards if we're trying to create this inclusive environment?
I could talk. Oh, sorry. Do you want to?
No, go ahead, Jeff.
I'll just talk very briefly about employee resource groups, which came out a lot in our study. So employee resource groups are, many organizations within organizations that are meant to support workers. Often these are either run by an organization's HR department, or just independently run completely, that's not affiliated with HR or anything. But the point of these groups or these organizations is to be a resource for employees of quote unquote diverse identities or minoritized identities. So at an organization or a company, you may have an employee resource group for women, one for Black people, one for people with disabilities, and so on and so forth. So that came up a lot in our study. And participants primarily talked about ERGs as a place where they could find supports, just general emotional, supports. But we also saw ERGs as maybe the epicenters of some of these whisper networks, people like to call it. So ways to navigate these workplaces, these organizations that are dominated by the kind of broader dominant groups, right? They're able to find other people like them, or find other people of minoritized identities who are going through who are facing some of these same challenges that we talked about earlier, such as toxic culture or microaggressions or what have you. And we saw participants turning to these spaces to find emotional supports, which goes along a very long way in terms of them staying at the company or the organization. And we also saw participants turning to these spaces to find collaborators on how, with an AI team specifically, to find collaborators to work with projects that they wanted to work on, you know, to really look at how AI is impacting or affecting minoritized communities or the communities that they belong to. So, you know, maybe you had a worker going to a queer employee research group and said, oh, Bill, do you want to do a study on, you know, how AI technology is specifically harming BIPOC queer communities, for example, or disabled queer communities? You know, they were able to find people like that, whereas their manager, they would get maybe the runaround from their manager in terms of pursuing that project. So that was, I thought it was a really beautiful thing we saw in our study. But I also don't want to overstate, you know, ERGs as either one size fits all or a cure-all for all woes faced by minoritized workers in tech companies. You know, we saw from our last event that there are many ways in which ERGs could go wrong. We could probably talk all day about this, but you know, where we saw when ERGs grew to a certain size and when top-down control became more of a thing, when these companies or organizations started to exert more control over ERGs, then we saw maybe some of the benefits starting to go down. So again, more work needs to be done on this. I think it's a very interesting area that I'd like to look at more, but that is those ones for support.
Yeah.
Just to add what Jeff is saying, you know, I think another way of ensuring that, you know, folks from minoritized communities can kind of navigate what Dr. Asper de Sefalberge, who's a professor at UC Merced, has described as a hostile obstacle course versus the pipeline, you know, and these barriers that are placed in the way of minoritized folks. So how to remove those barriers, how to help people navigate that, is to you know, ensure that people have mentors and sponsors, so people who are invested in their growth and, you know, speak positively about them when they're not in the room. You know, environments that are free of harassment, so where there are clear and effective policies on harassment and discrimination, and that employers are actually aware of. Where there's trust, so, you know, people can respectfully engage in conversations about marginalization and how folks from minoritized communities experience and move through the world, where those conversations can be had. And then also in an environment where people who are in ERGs or, you know, minoritized folks who are doing EDI work aren't just doing it from the side of their desk, like they're actually compensated for the work that they're doing because it's of great value to the organization. You know, in an environment where leadership operates with empathy and checks in regularly on employees and wants to know about their experiences in the workplace so that they can make the necessary changes. And then also an environment where self-care is prioritized, because, you know, the struggle is real and it's exhausting, you know, and you need to take that time to recuperate and recharge, and you need to make sure that, you know, an employer needs to make sure that there's the space to do that as well.
Yeah, so important. Allison, anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, just in terms of a holistic view, I think one of the pieces that we continue to advocate for is the leadership from the top. So statements are great, but also like deep commitments that includes setting explicit goals for representation, retention, and career progression, collecting data, committing to transparent data reporting, tracking, and internal accountability, like tying C-suite pay to D&I metrics or D&I goals. But I think honestly, like setting those explicit goals, I think has to be a priority from leadership and from C-suite. Totally agree about the importance of ERGs, and if that can be done in conjunction with a broader comprehensive strategy that is resourced, I think that is incredibly important. And then just implementing racially just and equitable approaches to the entire life cycle. So we talked a little bit about recruitment, about hiring, how we think about assignments, performance assessments, promotion pay, culture, collecting and analyzing internal data. And I think the other piece that hasn't quite been mentioned yet, but I just did want to add a focus on, if we're thinking about the entire sector, a focus on investing and deploying capital to startup entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds. So you get a much more robust, diverse, representative sample of folks starting fresh new ideas and innovative ideas and growing from the ground up.
No, I mean, that's key, right? Most of these projects all need money to move forward, and especially those folks that Jeff was mentioning that are really dedicated towards using AI for social good. They can't get funding, can't really launch their projects. One of the questions that's come up in the chat is, around what are the actual employees prioritizing as needs and changes that they want to see. I know all three of you work really closely with the actual stakeholders who are affected by these issues. And so I'm curious in terms of what you're hearing from them around need to be the day-to-day priorities, whether they're small changes or the kind of big changes that Allison, you were talking about in terms of the C-suite, goals and targets that need to be tied to compensation and things like that. What other actions are, the actual workers asking for?
This is anecdotal, so I'll go first, and then I would love my colleagues to jump in. I think we're starting to see a trend of more employees around employee activism. So I think it goes back to Jeff's point about what's the purpose of my work here, and this bigger vision around having some sort of positive social impact. And I think that is I think that'll continue to be a place for us to focus. And if I were in a position of leadership in an organization or a company, I would be thinking deeply about that aspect and how that is either attracting talent or potentially contributing to turnover of specific talent groups.
One thing that I heard, excuse me, was, I mean, it sounds pretty simple, but they want to see better, more meaningful representation at the top. So, companies talk a lot about diversifying their numbers and what have you, but, it's kind of an open secret that they use a lot of maybe kind of interesting reporting in the numbers to make their diversity goals seem like they're closer to being achieved or not. But essentially, when we have more diverse leaders that aren't only in the chief executive of DEI role, when we see a more diverse representation in all positions at the leadership, then workers, yeah, essentially that's what workers want. Because that is one way in which a company is actually following the values around DEI that they state or that they hope to achieve.
Echo, anything you want to add?
I don't, all I can say is yes to what Allison and Jeff are saying. I just see this a greater level in the past, couple of years of, the need for accountability for leaders and workers really employees really holding employers to account. That's definitely what I've seen in the last little while, more so than ever before.
Yeah, I've been seeing that a lot as well, and it's really exciting to see employees sort of transition and become empowered around what they want to see in their workplace, in their organization, and in the field more generally. We have a set of questions coming through in the chat and Q&A, which I think is really interesting, and it points to this idea that it's the implementation of some of these changes that really matter. It's not just about having an employee resource group, but it's about how that ERG might be structured. Is it about being open versus restricted to certain identities? Mentorship schemes are very different. And, it might be something that's pre-assigned by an HR manager versus, opportunities that exist to organically help people meet one another. And I would love to just hear from all of you in terms of what are the more specific ways that you're seeing some of these changes implemented that seem to make a bigger impact, and what are some of the factors that are driving their success?
Go ahead, Allison.
Oh, no, you go ahead. I'll go after you.
I was just going to say for mentorship in particular, mentorship goes two ways, and I think that programs that recognize that are far more successful. Programs that are clearly structured, because I think if you leave people, just to their own devices to navigate the mentorship relationship, often sometimes it just falls flat. But some key, I think, discussions, learning, training at the start of the relationship on what that means through an anti-oppression framework as well, recognizing power and privilege within the mentorship relationship goes a long way in fostering a healthy mentorship relationship that doesn't cause more harm than good.
That's such an important factor to really think about. Allison.
Yeah, one specific example that I think we continue to hear is echoed from the perspective of chief diversity officers who probably have all of these ideas, all of this experience, know exactly what they want to implement, but providing, and it doesn't have to be chief diversity officers. If there's someone who's tasked with developing out your DEI strategy, that person needs to have the power and authority to actually implement these practices and to have a budget and staff to be able to do it effectively. And that person can't be just the scapegoat for when the numbers don't quite add up, that you set your goals and you don't meet your targets. That person can't be the sole scapegoat. So I think really truly empowering the people that are responsible for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And again, going back to my other point, I would argue that has to be at the C-suite level as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with what both Allison and Akua said. To talk a little bit more about the mentorship aspect, it's very important that organizations, when they implement kind of more formal mentorship program, like we see a lot of informal mentorship that happens, women of color, specifically find themselves in that role a lot, and wanting to support others, their reports, to kind of, pave the way or to help to transform the organization or the company in a way that they would like to see transform, and essentially advocate for their reports. We see that a whole lot in terms of informal mentorship. What we see in terms of formal mentorship programs, if companies or organizations treat them very seriously, kind of what Akua said, just like they would treat a product, looking at data, looking to see what works, implementing it from this anti-oppression framework versus very kind of, checkboxy HR kind of way, to see and, reward employees, reward reports for both mentors and mentees for engaging in that program as well. Like we've seen successful models of these projects in various organizations and companies. So again, it's not just about having it, but in terms of really holding people accountable, and really, it's almost like you need to mentor the mentors as well, right? So we shouldn't assume like that's a very difficult skill that has to be developed over time, and that we need to pay a lot of attention to that as well.
Thank you. We have one last quick question, hopefully, maybe from the audience, and then I have one last question for all of you. Where do folks go when they leave? Do they, turn to academia? Do they just switch companies in search of a sort of more values-aligned workspace? Where are they going?
I haven't seen any evidence for people returning to or people going to academia. I don't know, Allison or Cliff, if y'all have. I haven't seen that in any studies or any reports or any published anything. So I think I don't want to say we can rule that out, but I just don't have. We just don't have evidence for that. They definitely go to other companies or organizations, and again, that's also something that we could study more in a future direction, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to add, it's always hard for researchers to advocate for something if they haven't seen all of the data. But yeah, I think there's some evidence of leaving and starting new things, whether that's like starting a new organization, starting a nonprofit, starting a startup company. I think there's some evidence of that, but I think we need a lot more data to figure out exactly like what the different patterns, both patterns in and then out are. But I also agree, I think there's a lot of churn within the tech sector. But yeah, would love to see another study on that.
So in the last few minutes that we have before we thank you and send you off with the rest of your day, what are the next steps needed to evolve this conversation? We've been talking about the importance of diverse perspectives in tech for many years. We've had several flashpoints. How do we keep evolving this conversation so it doesn't fall to the wayside, or that, all the great recommendations everyone's coming up with, just sort of sits in a corner in a dusty filing cabinet, if we still have those?
So maybe I'll just jump in the spirit of interdisciplinary collaboration, which CFAR is known for. I think it would actually be amazing to convene different sectors and compare and contrast some of the challenges and best practices from those different areas. Like, let's bring the legal profession into the conversation. Let's bring the medical profession into the conversation. Let's bring other industries and sectors together, because we're actually dealing with similar things, which I know we have all kind of alluded to. And there may be lessons that we can learn from each other. And this may be an issue that could be better tackled if we have a diversity of perspectives in terms of industries at the table.
Yeah. Allison.
Yeah, I love that idea. Two other things. I think we are at a very unique moment in time, and I think it behooves us to pay a lot of attention to what's happening in K-12 and post-secondary education, and think about, like, how are we preparing this next entire wave of folks that either can be going into these fields or are going to be completely left out. And for the ones who are going into these fields, are we integrating enough of the interdisciplinary, as Ekoa said, interdisciplinary conversations around things like ethics and history and politics, and just all of the different implications that I think are required to have a robust education in artificial intelligence. And then the second thing that we think a lot about, and I don't have a solution yet, is I think we've got to get a lot smarter on accountability, and, like, what are the accountability mechanisms? Because part of why we're continually in this conversation is that we're asking companies to do things and hoping that they'll do them. And there are some that are doing them, and then there are others that are not. So what are the accountability systems that we can build across both the public sector and the private sector?
I've been wondering the same thing. And finally, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree. So, I can't believe I didn't mention it earlier, but this interdisciplinary space is very, very important. And we actually saw, or in the study, we saw a lot of folks from minoritized backgrounds really reveling in that interdisciplinary space. They came to study AI, they came to work in AI because it was interdisciplinary by design, by definition. And so, we saw that the urge to work on those kinds of problems as, potentially something that helped to retain workers. So again, but I also agree with what Allison has said. We need to really, and folks are doing this. I don't want to pretend like no one's doing this. Of course, folks at University of Washington, a lot of different places are already doing this. Transform the way we think about technology and computer science, and integrate other perspectives from psychology, from just put my own field, not that it's perfect, sociology, the humanities, philosophy. Again, folks are already doing this, but we need to not forget. We need to kind of double down on that, and also we just need to not get tired. It's a marathon. We're going to keep talking about these issues pretty much forever. So we need to remember that it's a long term. Be happy with some of the short term fixes, but know that we need to work on these things in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, Echo brought up the importance of centering self-care in the work that we do to support the employees and the workers, but that also holds true for leaders in the EDI and DEI spaces. That we are in it for the long haul. I just want to thank all the panelists again. Thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your work, sharing your perspectives. And I hope you have a wonderful day.